as you know. The question is, can tree planting solve the climate crisis? And I'm going to give you three possible answers. A, yes, it's our best hope. B, significantly, but it's not our only hope. And C, seriously? Okay, so hands up, who believes A? B?
Yes.
A is it's our only or best hope. B is it can make a significant impact along with other things. And C is it's not going to really solve the climate crisis. So who says B? And C?
Oh.
All right.
So that's not going to quite help you.
Well, that's good, because if you had all put your hand up for C, then we could have gone straight to wine and snacks. And I want to start with a disclaimer. I do love grasses, but I do love a good tree. And I have got absolutely nothing against trees. I think they're awesome. So, as my talk goes, just remember, I'm not a grass Nazi. Okay, so I'm sure you, as members of WESA, are all aware of the problem. We are facing a climate change crisis because of increased greenhouse gases in our atmosphere that are causing temperatures to rise. And these are because of historical and ongoing burning of fossil fuels, as well as land cover change such as deforestation, conversion of natural vegetation to agriculture, and so on. And there's obviously been a lot of discussion, quite urgently, about how to keep us from boiling ourselves to death. And one of the solutions that keeps getting more and more attention is some form of tree planting or afforestation in the form as nature-based solutions or forest landscape restoration that is supposed to sequester carbon and help us keep our greenhouse gas concentrations at a survivable level. Now, people have been talking about planting trees to save us from the climate crisis for quite a long time, but at this stage, and for the last few years, the targets for doing this are absolutely staggering. And they come in the form of global restoration initiatives that are non-governmental or they not-for-profit, such as we've got the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that started last year and is going on until 2030. There's the Bond Challenge that is challenging governments around the world to commit targets for reforestation or forest restoration to the tune of 350 million hectares. So there's a whole lot of those restore forest, reverse deforestation, but there's also more and more corporate pledges to plant trees that fall under the carbon market. So that's basically to achieve net zero and offset emissions. The targets kind of are incredible. So there's the 350 million from the Bond Challenge, but there's also the trillion trees. Apple, Microsoft, Shell, you name it, have all made their own commitments. If you add them up, they amount to quite a large amount of forests and trees. And this obviously raises, and this has been strengthened a few years ago by the publication in the journal Science, 2019. There was a paper about the global tree restoration potential, and they argue that we could so they used remote sensing images and modeling and climate modeling to say we could have an extra almost 1 billion hectares of trees or forests. I know these kind of numbers hardly even are able to visualize them, but this, they very helpfully say this would be an area the size of the United States of America. And this could then take up 205 billion tons of carbons and capture about 2/3 of man-made emissions. So obviously people got very excited about this because that seems kind of doable.
Well, except where are people going to live?
Exactly. So this raises quite a few questions, including, first of all, is it actually effective? So firstly, are those figures correct? Is it really going to sequester that much carbon and keep it locked out of the atmosphere? Why this obsession with trees and forests instead of other ecosystems? How much land will it take? Well, they've given us that helpful map, but where will this happen? Undoubtedly not in the entire United States of America. And what are the impacts on local ecosystems and people? And if this happens, when it happens, or some of it happens, who benefits and who has to bear the costs? So it is quite a complicated issue. Okay, so let's start with the first question. Can it offset fossil fuel emissions? And this is a graph from the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. And it shows, starting in 1970 all the way to 2010, this is also old news already, the amounts produced every year. So this is not a cumulative amount in the atmosphere. This is how much we have pumped out year after year in any given year. The blue is non-CO2. It's things like methane, nitrous oxide, and fluoride compounds. So let's ignore them for now because trees aren't expected to take those up. But the dark orange and the light orange are carbon dioxide. The dark reddish orange is the amount that's produced from deforestation, from draining peatlands, and basically converting vegetation and releasing it from burning and soil disturbance. And the light orange, surprise, surprise, is the fossil fuel. So that emission is actually going up the most. You can see that the amount actually from deforestation and so on, it's the same again year after year. So it's still happening year after year, but it's actually kind of the same. But fossil fuels keep going up. Now, the thing is, what are trees really doing? They're kind of growing and taking up carbon dioxide. So which of these two is it really reversing in terms of what happened? And here's a clue from a paper that was written in response to this 2019 paper that says trees are our only hope. And they point out that keeping fossil carbon in its original geological storage is self-evidently a more effective solution to climate change than releasing it and then capturing it in trees. Secondly, allowing trees to grow where they once grew is only replacing the carbon that was previously lost through land use change. So it physically can only really take that dark orange bit. It can't take all that fossil fuel stuff back. And so it doesn't address fossil fuel emissions, and then they estimated in their paper that sequestering 100 gigatons of carbons into new forests is equivalent of 10 years of emissions. So it's a short-term stopgap, but it's not going to solve the crisis. Or, as William Bond and co-authors said a bit more pithily, consider that the coal that drove 200 years of the Industrial Revolution took 400 million years to accumulate. How can we possibly expect to grow enough trees to stuff all the carbon back in again in just a few decades? Okay, so that's the question kind of answered, but the drive to plant all these trees is ongoing. And it's always interesting to take a little bit more of a historical perspective. In this case, whose idea was this in the first place? And I came across, so I deal with this issue sort of on an ongoing basis. I keep finding interesting but also freaky new bits of information. So Freeman Dyson, who might mean something to some of you, he is a very well-known mathematician and physicist. Back in 1976, he wrote a little 5-page or 4-page paper about can we control the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And his thrust was, it's not something we need to worry about. But should some crisis arise, we could plant huge amounts of forests. We'd have to fertilize them like crazy, but we could sort the crisis out in the short term. That's what he said in his paper. He also had some interesting ideas about water hyacinth being another possible source of carbon fixation because it's so fast growing and there's quite a lot of aquatic bodies that could hold it. So he suggested that large plantations of fast-growing trees could remove enough CO2 from the atmosphere to give us a chance to switch to industries and stuff that don't rely on fossil fuels. And he said this could be done if it was done in countries where labor is cheap. So even he didn't really see this as a long-term solution, but that doesn't matter because there's obviously a lot of companies and other parties that have a strong vested interest in offsetting carbon emissions because emitting carbon is what makes them money, and that includes fossil fuel companies and other companies that use a lot of fossil fuels in transport and in their day-to-day business. There is also a rapidly growing market for these carbon offsets because all these companies are now talking about being net zero by 2035 or whenever. And so there's also a huge growing industry of traders. So people are basically speculating and making their money trading in these carbon credits. So there's a lot of incentive to keep this idea alive. But yeah, that brings us to the question where we're going to put these trees. So there's this very helpful atlas of forest landscape restoration opportunities. There is, apart from the sort of kind of somewhat brazen carbon offset market, there is also WWF and all these organizations are investing a lot in forest restoration. Some of it in places that really truly had forests, but some of them not so much. So anyway, this atlas is mainly supporting the bond challenge and any other government planning around where they might do forest restoration. It's got these lovely interactive maps. You can open the website, you can zoom in on a place of interest, and you can see whether your forest is intact, as in the dark green, whether it's fragmented or managed, which is the luminous lighter green, whether it's degraded forest, which is the yellow, or whether it's out and out deforested, which is the mustard brown. And in this atlas and the accompanying paper, they say the world has vast amounts of deforested and degraded forest landscapes that deliver limited benefits to both humans and nature. These areas of historical and recent loss provide opportunities for future gain. The maps in this atlas represent the first ever global approximation of the extent and location of the opportunities for forest landscape restoration. Sounds pretty awesome, but the devil is in the details. So I'm sure you're itching to zoom in a little, so let's do that. And we're zooming into the Lowveld of South Africa, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And here is Kruger National Park shown in red. And oops, it's deforested with a little bit of fragmented and managed. And so are the surrounding farming areas. So this atlas is hugely misleading. It basically models, is there enough rain to have more trees? But we know our grasslands and savannas are open and grassy because of fire and grazing and a long evolution of very different ecological processes. But this is being presented to governments with some consulting from the same institute to say, well, you know, these are opportunities for planting trees or for restoring forests. But clearly, when you look at areas that we know, some of it is just plain rubbish. And the same goes for South America. So here is this big area of deforested land, which is actually the Cerrado, which are the Brazilian savannas. Rich in biodiversity, they're the most biodiverse savannas, probably, and very reliant on regular fires for all their beautiful veld flowers to bloom and for their ants to, you know, whatever. So very misleading information is also being put out there about where trees could and should be planted. And this has obviously raised the hackles of every self-respecting savanna ecologist, and they have started pouring out the papers, and one of them has this map which shows in the sort of elastoplast pink areas of forest restoration opportunity. In the dark purple, the grassy biomes, and in the bright orange, where those two overlap. And what you can see, so basically the dark orange areas are areas that are savannas or grasslands or some kind of grassy biome that isn't naturally forest, but which is mapped and marketed as opportunity to plant trees. And in Africa, we get quite a healthy dose of that. And this is obviously a huge concern because companies forestry companies or consultants who want to get in on the tree planting restoration action are eyeing out these areas to have tree planting projects. From that same paper of Bond and others who was talking about stuffing all that carbon back in, they again show this map of Africa with the reddish areas showing where tree planting potential is advertised on grassland. These are the exact areas that have got the highest richness of ungulates and carnivores, so our wildlife. This is literally targeting our most important wildlife areas and also areas most important for cattle farming, so for livestock farming. So interestingly, these are also the areas that overlap. So on these grassy ecosystems, wildlife, livestock to some extent coexist, but they all don't exist very easily with plantations of trees. And so I don't think I need to tell you, I mean we live in Makanda after all, but grassy biomes provide a host of critical ecosystem services. Some papers recently that have done the big ecosystem service valuations have found that grasslands, especially if restored, deliver equivalent ecosystem services to temperate forests. But that has been really overlooked, and they're cultural ecosystem services, they're provision of food and livestock farming, they are important for catchment areas and all sorts. And most of these ecosystems, and of course rich biodiversity, so these ecosystems services are again threatened if you're planting a hollow of trees because they rely on the ecosystem being grassy and open. And what is really overlooked is that grasslands actually store a whole lot of carbon. It varies with the type of grassland and the type of soil and the type of management, but grassy biomes are estimated to store close to 1/3 of the world's terrestrial carbon pool. And in fact, there was a deluge of criticism of that Baston et al. Paper, the one with the tree potential can solve the climate crisis, because they had kind of forgotten to put that into their calculations. So grassland carbon is often not put into the equation when people advertise how much additional carbon you will gain from planting trees. And there's been quite a few experiments and measurements and then reviews and synthesis, and the bottom line is converting grasslands to tree plantations either leads to an overall carbon loss, or where it leads to an overall net carbon gain, the loss is from the soil and it goes into the above ground biomass. The thing though about carbon in grassland soils is when there's a fire, it stays there. When there's a drought, when there's insect attacks, the carbon in the soil is really pretty safe. But the carbon in a plantation or even a natural forest is quite vulnerable, especially with hotter and hotter climates, to insect attack, to pathogens, to drought, and to wildfires. So actually, grasslands are a pretty good option and increasingly reliable in storing carbon with our changing climates. So there's no shortage of this kind of evidence being out there, but people still cling onto this idea that forests are good and trees are good. And remember my disclaimer, I also agree that forests and trees are good, but not everywhere and not for everything. And while writing a paper about forest landscape restoration in rangelands, I came across this really interesting historical literature that actually traces this urge to plant trees to solve the climate. And it goes all the way back to the 17th century, because the French had a really influential forestry group or forestry school that argued, because the French themselves at that stage were worried about desertification, the dunes encroaching and mobile sand and so on. So there was a lot of interest in trees, making it rain more, making it less hot and dry, and so on. So that sort of theory, as you can guess from the fact that it came all the way back from the 17th century, hasn't really held up to modern scientific scrutiny, but from one generation to the next, it got passed on. It became really influential in all the colonial forestry services, and the forestry services themselves were a very dominant institution in the colonial administration, in India, in Algeria, in Madagascar, you name it. First the French, and then the English took on a lot of that as well. So there's some really fascinating work by Diana Davis that teases out these historical roots of our fetish for trees, for planting trees to fix the climate. And the general assumption was that areas that are dry and look degraded to European sensibilities once had forests, but the local land users deforested and degraded them. And if you can only bring the forest back, they'll bring back the rain, they'll bring back fertility, and they'll make it all go away. And that led to targets like planting forest on 30% of Algeria's land surface. That was going to support civilization and make it a bit more like France. So there was this genuine idea that a set amount of tree cover was necessary for the climate to be suitable for civilized habitation. Now, when you read that, you think it's a bit silly and ludicrous, but there's actually a remarkable continuity. After the colonies became independent, most of those experts went into the UN organizations and into the whole development scene. And there's actually a remarkable community of this idea that forests make the climate better right to this day. Now, the other thing is, people think, well, planting trees is a truly victimless crime. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? You know, trees, come on. Well, things can go wrong, and they have gone wrong, and you as WESA members know this because I know you're keen on your tree poppers. And there are some pretty scary examples of absolutely well-intentioned interventions. For example, the Baringo Rangers in Kenya had the FAO persuade the Kenyan government to plant prosopis as a fodder crop and to reverse desertification. And now you can physically not walk through those places because they're so choked with prosopis. And these maps, I mean, they're too small to really see the detail, but from the highlands of India, there's these beautiful shola grassland forest mosaics. They've been used for eucalyptus and pine plantations, and they've generated a lot of escapes, and so these grasslands are also now full of invasive trees, which is exactly the problem we have around here. The other thing is that a lot of these big, so there has been some kickback, pushback or whatever, probably both, against this tree planting. And so more and more the marketing is getting more sophisticated about we're restoring forest, we're planting indigenous tree, the right tree in the right place. But the fact is, those incredibly ambitious targets and that urgency to do it sooner rather than later means only large-scale afforestation with fast-growing species will do the job. And in fact, a review also in 2019 that was published in Nature by Lewis and others, it went through all the pledges from different countries up to that date and found that almost half the area pledged to the Bond Challenge, which is a not-for-profit restoration initiative, is destined for large-scale plantations of pines, eucalypts for pulp, of agriculture crops like oil palm, and so on. So these are not actually real forests. And the problem with these is, as you know, they threaten our water resources by transpiring more and reducing stream flow. They increase albedo, so forests have a very dark color that absorbs more than it reflects compared to light-colored grasses. So it actually has a warming effect that's been modeled to actually negate quite a bit of the carbon gain effect on climate warming. They reduce biodiversity, they reduce range and productivity, and pines and eucalypts pose like huge wildfire risks. And all of this while providing a fraction of the ecosystem services and storing an estimated 40 times less carbon than natural forests. So all this stuff is going up in the guise of solving the climate and is absolutely doing more harm than good. Now, I have written about this, other people have written, and the comeback is, no, but we're not in favor of plantations. We want to do like genuine forest restoration. But the skeptics have done their homework. And so, for example, AFRI 100 is a sub-project of the Bond Challenge that aims to restore 100 million hectares in Africa. And this map shows pledges. So the grey areas are countries that haven't pledged towards the Bond Challenge. And you can see they're mostly the dry countries that aren't really that great for forest restoration. The orange are mostly pledging agroforestry and genuine forest restoration, but the countries in red have got large-scale plantations as a significant part of their pledges. And standout, for example, is Mozambique with 1 million hectares. And in fact, this report on AFRI 100 concluded that Mozambique major pulp and paper companies were benefiting from restoration funding. And of course, it's not that surprising because it's really hard to find not-for-profit funding to restore 350 million hectares. But if you can plant trees that actually turn a profit, like pulp and paper or oil palm, then you kind of kill the two birds with one stone. So you pledge towards the Bond Challenge, you look good in the restoration world, and you turn a tidy profit from planting commercial trees. Madagascar, most of their target is planted forests and woodlands, and Rwanda as well. So there are some countries that don't really buy into this, but in some countries, governments have really bought into this thing of we solve the climate crisis and we've got plantations. Okay, so I'm making this sound hugely dystopian, but let's still look who wins, who loses. If you Google tree planting impacts, you will get a deluge of positive material. Like this map from the Trillion Trees Initiative that says forest restoration benefits people, nature, and climate. And of course, when done correctly, it does, and it can. If you're in an area that has genuinely been deforested, or if you're in an area where there's people farming and they're planting fruit trees and do agroforestry. So there's no denying. Remember me hugging my trees? I'm not denying that trees can't do good. But in terms of absolute amount of projects, those lovingly participatory, properly done projects, by their very nature, are likely to be smaller and more local. But this is the narrative that obviously people use. In my reading and researching and debating and whatever, my colleagues and I are pretty much agreed that this idea that you can plant trees to fix the climate crisis is essentially a neo-colonial approach. The Northern Hemisphere countries mostly are the ones who've caused most of the crisis and who are continuing to. Of course, South Africa itself is a major emitter, so is China, so are lots of other. And a lot of developing countries are saying, well, now it's our turn to emit, to also industrialize. But the bottom line is still that the crisis is the making largely of developed countries who are pushing really hard to continue emitting and to offset their carbon with planting trees. But most of the places that are targeted for tree planting are in the global south. And these projects, because they need large areas and to sequester carbon, they can't be harvested or touched, and they have to be carefully audited, so they kind of become off limits. So these forest projects have got a pretty unpleasant track record of excluding existing land users, their access rights, their activities, their livelihoods. The interventions, even if they're clothed in participatory approaches, tend to be top-down, even just in their idea of what they're trying to do, and then in their sort of implementation. Because they're quite technocratic, they have to really account for their carbon, they by their nature tend to be quite large-scale and technocratic. So the governments of the receiving countries are often quite keen because money is coming in, but they're very prone to sort of elite capture. They often play into political agendas that try to exclude things like rangeland users and pastoralists. And the issue I have with it also is that afforestation is promoted as this win-win-win for climate, for ecosystems, and for people, without acknowledging the inevitable trade-offs. If you're taking one land use and you're converting it, you might gain something really amazing, but something else has got to give, and that is really, really downplayed. And case studies, there are good projects. I'm not denying that there are some good projects, but a lot of case studies have shown that the positive local impacts are often slow to materialize, and they're often largely overstated, like employment and getting resources and so on, while the negative impacts, like losing access to land, water resources dwindling, forage resources dwindling and so on, are often quite quick to materialize. And the bottom line is that on the whole, and again, not every project is like that, marginalized populations are bearing most of the cost of climate change mitigation. So this is not breaking news. There has been a lot written about this in the scientific peer-reviewed literature. There has been quite a lot in the media as well. There has been a huge pushback, both on the sort of social justice front and on the ecological disaster front. But the push to plant trees to solve the climate crisis remains really strong. But I hope that I've made the point that afforestation is not going to solve the climate crisis. And this is pretty well supported by now. It's a distraction from the need to reduce emission. At the last COP in Egypt, I read somewhere that there were over 600 lobbyists from from emitting countries that were part of the negotiations. There's a huge, powerful economic lobby behind the idea that you can offset your way out of the climate crisis, but we can't. So there is a huge need to reduce emission, and there's a big resistance to it. Planting trees, yes, it can sequester carbon. It's not as simple as people make it out to be, but yes, it can. But it's buying us a little bit of time. It's not a permanent solution, so we still need to get on with the real solution. The carbon storage potential has been vastly overstated because the existing ecosystem storage has been often underestimated, but also the fact is, yes, those pine trees might sequester a lot of carbon, but then what is going to happen to them? A lot of them get turned into toilet paper and packaging, and that carbon isn't necessarily going to stay out of the atmosphere forever either. They can cause huge ecological damage, especially when they take the form of commercial plantation. A lot of it can and has resulted in land dispossession, and so there's social justice issues. And this line from a paper that is already 20 odd years old sums it up. It says, this approach to global warming, which is basically planting lots and lots of trees, is based on bad science. It enlarges rather than reduces society's ecological footprints and reinforces neocolonialist structures of power. So this is not 20 odd years old, so this is not new. But despite this, tree planting remains popular in the public opinion and of course in the eyes of investors, government and governments. So what's to be done? I think there needs to be a lot more awareness of the value and ecology of different ecosystems so that restoration of forests happens where forest once was, but savannas are not degraded forests and they have a lot of value, including carbon sequestration, that is underestimated. In grassy biomes, it's really important that we realize that existing carbon stores should be protected and we shouldn't be transforming natural grass into plantations because we're losing carbon and so much else. And in fact, the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration has, in the last year, finally added a page on savannas and grasslands, thanks to pressure and lobbying from some of these groups that I've mentioned. We need to do all we can to reduce emissions. There's quite a bit we can do as individual consumers, but obviously it also has to happen at a higher level. We need to protect existing forest. A lot of this is going on while forest is being cut down, which is a whole travesty in its own right. And we can totally plant trees. There's a lot of forest restoration that benefits ecology, people, and the climate. There's urban greening, there's agroforestry, there's shade trees. There's a lot of scope to plant trees. But please, let's just remember, the right tree, in the right place, and let's not get our hopes up that it'll solve the climate crisis while we drive our SUVs and so on. Thank you so much for coming.